Hi, friends. Now that Christmas is over, I thought I would share some of my thoughts regarding the birth narratives found in the Gospels. I've had this video idea on my mind for a while now, but I thought it was maybe a little unnecessarily divisive, so I decided to hold off until after the Christmas season to post my thoughts. But this topic is near and dear to my heart, in a way. This is one of the first topics that I really dug into with regard to textual criticism, and this was a crucial step for me on my path towards deconstruction. Instead of only outlining the differences, I thought it would be fun if I told my story alongside telling the differences in the birth narratives. I thought I would explain how I changed my mind as I learned this information. I'm actually going to split this topic up into a few videos, at least two. In this video, I only want to cover the genealogies of Jesus presented in Matthew and Luke. In another video, I'll talk about the rest of the birth narrative outside of the genealogies, and I might do a video dedicated to only my changing thought process as I learned this information. Let's jump into it. Okay, to begin, let's talk about the Gospel of Mark. In the intro, I mentioned that I would discuss the genealogies in Matthew and Luke. Well, Mark's the earliest Gospel, right? So where's the genealogy in Mark? There is none. Let's take a look at Mark chapter 1. Mark chapter 1 begins with John the Baptist about to baptize Jesus already as an adult. Yep, there is no birth narrative, genealogy included, in the Gospel of Mark, the oldest Gospel. That seems a little weird, but that's the truth. I'll tell you more about what I thought when I found out that the earliest Gospel didn't have a birth narrative or genealogy at all later, but for now, let's move on to the Synoptic Gospels. Let's do the Gospel of Matthew first. Matthew chapter 1 begins with a genealogy, which stretches all the way back from Jesus to Abraham. That's an impressive time frame, since common Catholic understanding is that Abraham would have lived 2,000 years before Jesus was born. Can you trace your lineage back 2,000 years? I know I can't. I can't trace mine back more than 200 years, much less 2,000. And that's with the help of modern technology, like the internet. What's worse is that modern scholarly consensus is that Abraham wasn't a real historical person. On page 42 of the 1999 book Reconstructing the Society of Ancient Israel by Paula McNutt, it is written, "In any case, it is now widely agreed that the so-called patriarchal or ancestral period is a later literary construction, not a period of actual history in the ancient world. The same is the case for the Exodus and the wilderness period, and more widely for the period of the Judges." So we have no genealogy in the oldest Gospel, and we have a genealogy that seems to connect Jesus to a mythical figure in the second Gospel. A strange start. And let's zoom down to the name of Jesus' father, Joseph, and Joseph's father, Jacob. Remember that name, Jacob. The birth narrative in Matthew starts after the genealogy, and I'll save that for another video. For now, let's move on to the Gospel of Luke. Unlike Matthew, the Gospel of Luke starts right away with the birth narrative, and it saves the genealogy for a little later on. Here is Luke chapter 1. It starts with the birth narrative. It actually starts with the birth of John the Baptist, but we'll skip all that for now. We're even going to skip all of chapter 2, which is Jesus' birth narrative, and we're going to go to Luke chapter 3. Chapter 3 starts where Mark 1 starts, John the Baptist about to baptize Jesus, but the end of chapter 3 is oddly interrupted by a genealogy present on the screen now. So, unlike the genealogy found in Matthew, Luke's genealogy starts with Jesus and goes all the way back to Adam, the Son of God. Now, that's an impressive genealogy. You thought that Abraham was good? Well, how about Adam? How the heck would anybody be able to trace their lineage back to Adam? Well, somehow the author of the Gospel of Luke did it, and wait a minute. Joseph's father's name is Heli? Here it is. Jesus was the son, so it was thought of Joseph, the son of Heli. How are Catholics supposed to make sense of the fact that Joseph had two different fathers, apparently? Well, there's actually a bunch of different apologetic answers to this. The most common apologetic theory is probably the idea that Luke was actually giving Mary's genealogy, not Joseph's. Scott Smith's blog, All Roads Lead to Rome, calls out this exact explanation in his article, and it actually calls it out as explanation number 1. Theory number 1, Luke's genealogy is Mary's, not Joseph's, genealogy of Mary, mother of Jesus. One ancient theory, and perhaps the most common, is that Luke is providing Mary's genealogy, not Joseph's genealogy. The author of this article does go on to say that this one is a bit of a stretch, though, because Luke provides Joseph's name in the genealogy. Nevertheless, Luke's gospel was heavily inspired by one of its chief sources, Mary herself. Let's examine the other theories. So the author quickly moves on from theory 1. Now, this is a pretty common apologetic, but I don't buy it. Why don't I buy it? Well, the author of this blog says the exact reason himself. The text says it's Joseph. If we look at Luke again, Luke says that Joseph is the son of Heli, not the son-in-law of Heli. Scott Smith does call that a bit of a stretch, though, so why don't we do what all good Catholics should do and turn to Jimmy Akin? In this 1997 article from Catholic Answers written by Jimmy Akin, titled The Genealogies of Christ, Jimmy writes, "Some have tried to answer this by saying that Luke gives Jesus' lineage through Mary, not through Joseph. But this is not supported by the text. Luke states that Joseph was the son of Heli, not that Mary was the daughter of Heli." So Jimmy goes on to say, but what about Jesus' foster father, Joseph? Here we have more direct information. The 2nd century historian Julius Africanus, a native of Israel, records information given by Christ's remaining family in his day. According to their family genealogy, Joseph's grandfather Mathan, mentioned in Matthew, married a woman named Estha, who bore him a son named Jacob. After Mathan died, Estha married his relative Melchi, mentioned in Luke, and bore him a son named Heli. Marrying relatives was common among Jews at the time. Jacob and Heli were thus half-brothers. Heli died childless, so Jacob married his widow and fathered Joseph, who was biologically the son of Jacob, but legally the son of Heli. And Jimmy gets this from a book called Ecclesiastical History or Church History, written by Eusebius. Ecclesiastical History is available online and is linked in the description, showing on the screen now, so you can check out the exact work that Jimmy cites. I will admit that this explanation is way better than the It's Mary's Genealogy apologetic, but I still fall on the side that I just think that the authors of Matthew and Luke had different prerogatives when they were writing their Gospels. Why am I not biting Jimmy's hook? Well, to answer that question, let's talk about Eusebius. Dr. Lynn Cohick, an American New Testament scholar, author, and the current dean and professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary University in Illinois, says that Eusebius is a notoriously unreliable historian, and so anything he reports should be critically scrutinized. See, Eusebius wasn't just a historian, he was a Catholic bishop. He wasn't exactly impartial here, and we know that Eusebius is willing to bend the truth in order to fit an agenda. Eusebius's Life of Constantine, which he wrote as a eulogy shortly after the emperor's death in 337 AD, is, quote, often maligned for perceived factual errors, deemed by some so hopelessly flawed that it cannot possibly be the work of Eusebius at all, but others attribute this perceived flaw in this particular work as an effort at creating an overly idealistic hagiography, calling him a Constantinian flunky, since as a trusted advisor to Constantine, it would be politically expedient for him to present Constantine in the best light possible. And lastly, and most importantly about Eusebius, Eusebius was born somewhere around 260 to 265 AD. He was writing, at the earliest, at the tail end of the 3rd century and into the 4th century. Joseph's fathers, Heli and Jacob, would have been born approximately 50 years BC. So Eusebius is writing about genealogies of people born around 300 years before him. Why should I believe him? 300 years is like 10 generations. At best, Eusebius was talking with very old men, asking them about their great, 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 great grandparents. At best. That's why I doubt. Is it impossible that Jimmy's explanation is correct? No, of course not. It could totally be correct. But we know that both of the genealogies include Abraham, who modern scholars admit never existed. And we know that one of them goes all the way back to Adam, which is just preposterous. We know that the authors of both Gospels differ on a bunch of other details. More on that in another video. And so the most plausible explanation to me is that the authors of Matthew and Luke just didn't know the correct genealogies of Jesus because nobody knew anybody's correct genealogies back then. The authors were probably just trying to establish that Jesus was from the line of David, since he had to be in order to fulfill prophecy. Matthew's genealogy is pretty blatant in its effort to fulfill prophecy, and Matthew's gospel in general is pretty blatant in its attempt to fulfill prophecy, but more on that in the next video. Notably, I think Jimmy kind of knows this. Jimmy ends his article by saying, "The problem isn't finding a way to reconcile them, but given the flexibility of ancient Hebrew genealogies, finding which way is correct. More interesting is why the genealogies are different. Matthew stresses Christ as the successor of David and follows the line of kings. Luke stresses Christ as the Son of God and traces back to Adam, the Son of God." The authors had different goals, and they weren't afraid to kind of make genealogies up to fit their goal. This is a part of the genre of the time and isn't particularly surprising. And frankly, Christians shouldn't have a real problem saying that these genealogies are not veridical. They conflict because neither of them is probably correct, and the authors were just trying to make a theological point, not a historical point. Catholics, I'm sure that probably a bunch of you disagree with me. I look forward to engaging with you all in the comments as much as possible. And stay tuned for the next video where I'm going to discuss the rest of the birth narrative, where I focus on the non-genealogical discrepancies between the birth narratives in the various Gospels. But, until next time.